I want to modify this frame to include all the technology you would find in a modern gravel bike. I want to run a modern through-axle wheel set, so I want to start by modifying the rear sets to install through axles. I also want to run disc brakes, so I want to add some mounts so I can run disc brakes on this frame. Modern gravel standard is to use flat mount calipers. So when I build this bracket, I need it to accommodate those flat mounts. The crankset I'm using is a 1x crank. It's got a narrower Q factor than the crank that this frame would have had when it was new. So I need to modify the stays to add clearance for the crank. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to run internal cables. So I'm going to put this in the mill and cut some slots in the frame to allow me to run the cables internally. So let's start with the through axle. Let's go over to the mill and I'll show you what I'm going to do. This frame was initially designed to use quick release axles, so the diameter inside the dropouts is only 10 millimeters. I want to run 12 millimeter through axles on this frame, so I need to open those up to 12 millimeters so the axle will fit. I've got the frame mounted to my vise, I've got it clamped down, and I've leveled the rear dropout so that it's parallel to the table in both directions. The last time I did this, I used a twist drill, and it didn't work out that well. I've learned a bit from that. This time I'm going to use a boring head. So the minimum capacity of my boring head here is 10.5 millimeters. That dropout axle hole is only 10. The first cut's going to be a little bit heavy, but I've centered the tool on the axle. My plan is to bore it to 10.5 millimeters and then slowly step it out, probably in 1/4 millimeter increments, and bore that hole out to 12 millimeters. And that'll give me a 12 millimeter hole that's perfectly centered, and I'll make sure that I get it to the right size for the axle. Typically when I've done this kind of conversion, I've welded the nut to the frame, but I want to do it a little bit differently this time. I want that nut to be removable, kind of like it is on a modern frame. I made the axle nut from some 6061 aluminum. I turned it to shape in the lathe, tapped it, and then I cut its profile in the mill. I want to secure the nut to the frame with the original fender mount, so I drilled a 5 millimeter hole so I could bolt it to the frame. Once installed, the axle fits through the frame and threads into the nut. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using flat mount calipers on this frame. On most of the bikes I own that have flat mount calipers, those calipers mount to the lower stay. Usually they're integrated into the dropouts. On this frame, however, there is just not enough space between the stays to fit the caliper. So I'm going to install the caliper on the upper stay. To figure out where that goes, I clamped the caliper to the rotor and I rolled it around to see where it contacted the stay. My plan for modifying the stay for flat mount calipers is to make some steel spools that will bolt to the caliper. I'll then notch the stay so that those calipers will sit inside the stay, and I'll weld them in place. And that will create a good solid foundation for the caliper. So I'm going to start by notching the frame. To do that, I'm going to add some aluminum spacers to the underside of the caliper, and I'm going to mark its location on the stay. I'll then use my grinder to rough cut it out, and then I'll use a file and my Dremel to fit it to final shape. Once I had the stay notched, I figured out the geometry for some spools. I made these out of some 1/2-inch steel rod that I had on hand. I cleaned them up in the lathe to give them a good surface for mounting the caliper, and then I drilled them out for a 5 millimeter bolt. Because the caliper is going to mount directly to the frame without any sort of an adapter, I needed some adjustability. So I took the lower bracket, I put it in the mill, and I slotted it out. Once the spools were done, I bolted them to the caliper to make sure they fit, and I welded them in place. I'm going to add a brace between the stays to improve the rigidity of the rear triangle with the rear brake. I used some 1/2-inch steel tubing that I had on hand. I shaped it to match the stays and mounted it at the same angle as the seat tube. I finished by grinding the welds with my Dremel so that it would match the style of the rest of the bike. I have my mind set on running a 1x crankset on this frame. A big problem though is that when the crank arms are rotated around, they hit the chainstays. I decided to reshape the chainstays to add some clearance. I clamped the top and bottom of the stays to prevent them from distorting, and then I reshaped them. I added clearance with a peen and a punch. I want the bike to look like it came with disc brakes, so I used a cutoff wheel and I removed the original cantilever bosses. Since I reshaped the stays, I needed to double check the alignment of the rear dropouts. I used a laser to do that. I set it up so it ran down the center line of the bike, and then I measured the distance from the beam to each dropout. Fortunately, they were the same and I didn't have to make any modification. I have never been a fan of top tube mounted cables. I don't think they're particularly attractive, and every time you look down, they're just right there. So I wanted to run integrated cables on this frame. I wanted it to look like it came that way though, so I decided to remove the original cable stops. I did that by grinding them off with a flap disc. That left some grinding marks and it wore through the paint, so I used a little bit of body filler to restore the height. I then masked it and painted it to match. After I'd removed the cable stops, the next thing I did was cut new slots for the cables to route them internally. I clamped the frame into my mill and I cut 6mm by 22mm slots. I cut 3 slots, one at the top near the head tube, and that's for the derailleur cable and the brake hose to route into. And then I cut 2 down near the bottom bracket, one for each the derailleur cable and the brake hose. I offset the 2 slots near the bottom bracket so they weren't in line with each other to prevent weakening the frame. By using the mill and watching the DRO, I was able to get all the slots identical. And because I used an end mill, they looked professionally done, just like they had been done at the factory. When I reshaped the stays, I left some hammer marks in the surface, so I'm applying a coat of body filler to smooth those out. I'm using just regular Bondo I got from my hardware store. I let that Bondo cure for a couple of hours, and then I shaped it with some 120 grit sandpaper. This blends the Bondo into the rest of the frame so that once it's primed and painted, you won't know it's there. For the paint itself, I started by applying a coat of high build primer. I let that dry overnight and then I wet sanded it with 400 grit sandpaper. This will fill in any scratches from the heavy grit sandpaper or any imperfections in the body filler. To restore the paint on this frame, I am only going to repaint the rear triangle, only the part that I modified. I am using some acrylic enamel spray paint. To match the color, I went to my local hardware store and I bought the cans of blue they had. They only had 2 cans, so the decision here wasn't that tough. I took the paint and I sprayed it on some masking tape, and then I stuck it to the frame and I compared it in the light. I chose the one that was closer. The match isn't great, but sometimes when you only have 2 options, you only have 2 options. Once that was done, I applied an even coat of blue paint to the rear of the frame. While the blue paint was drying, I applied some touch-up paint to the rest of the frame. There was some scratches, some damage on the head tube. I filled those in, and then I went and touched up the decals. This bike has some pretty cool decals on it, so I didn't want to mess those up. These are actually glow in the dark, and I'm quite surprised that 25 years later they still work. The touch-up paint has dried for a few days. Now I'm going to scuff the entire frame with a Scotch-Brite pad. This will roughen the surface. It'll give that clear coat something to stick to. The ID of this head tube measures 33.8 millimeters. That means it's designed for a 1 1/8 inch straight steer fork. I don't have a fork for this bike yet. Given that I'm modifying the rear for through axles and disc brakes, it makes sense to buy a fork that already has those. Finding a modern through axle disc fork with a 1 1/8 inch steer though, it's getting kind of hard to do. I've got some ideas of places we can look. Let's see what we can find. I'm using Professional 2K Clear Coat to finish off the paint. This will tie the paintwork in with the original paint. It will also protect the original paint and restore its gloss. After I painted the frame, I switched over and I painted the fork and stem. I started those by scuffing the finish with a Scotch-Brite pad. I then applied a coat of color and a coat of clear. I went with white for the fork and the stem. I think that will really tie them in well with the paint scheme on the bike. The paint is cured for about 48 hours. I'm really eager to get it put together and see how it rides. So let's start first, let's install the fork. I'm using a generic cartridge bearing type headset. I chose this one specifically because it doesn't have any branding. I cut the steer to length using a plumbing tubing cutter. I really like doing it this way because it leaves a good finish that looks professionally done. The only downside is you can only use it on aluminum. I am using a pair of Ultegra hydraulic 11-speed levers on this bike. These work really well with GRX derailleurs and I like that they have a metal body. I want to run a normal length stem on this bike, just like you'd find on a proper gravel bike. This one is 100 millimeters long. I'm running a set of 42 centimeter drop bars. I'd planned to use a set of Zip Explorers, but I looked everywhere. I could not find those. So I'm gonna use these. I think they'll work. I am gonna run a GRX 1x11 drivetrain. I'm gonna use a 42 chainring and an 11 to 42 cassette. That'll give me a 1-to-1 climbing gear, but also a higher gear for when I need it. There are only a couple mountain cassettes that are compatible with GRX. This is an SLX or an M7000 cassette. It does require a 1.8 millimeter spacer when installed on road or gravel wheels. Before installing the rear derailleur, I chased the threads with an M10 by 1.0 tap. I did this to remove paint that may have gotten in there when I painted the bike. Since I've changed the cable routing, I need a way to hold the cable firmly to the bike. I am using some rivet-on cable brackets. I like these, they work really well, but they're quite stressful to install. You start by drilling an 1/8 inch hole in the frame. You then install a pop rivet and pop it in place. The derailleur cable and brake hose route into and through the down tube. The derailleur cable exits on the drive side, while the brake hose exits on the brake side. Both attach to the mounts that I added to the top of the stays. I designed and printed the 3 cable grommets. These are made from TPU. The finish right off the printer is rough, so I used a heat gun to melt and smooth the surface. The finished grommets fit tightly and should keep water out of the frame. I was a bit concerned about the reach on this bike. These levers I'm using, they're longer than most of Shimano's other levers. I was going to install a 0 setback post that I have on hand. That would shift me forward, it would reduce the reach. Unfortunately, when I went looking for that post, I couldn't find it anywhere. I did find this carbon post that is the right diameter. It is a 20 millimeter setback post. I measured my other gravel bikes from the tip of the saddle to the center of the bars, and I think that this is going to be a better fit anyway. I am using a pair of tubeless WTB Sendero tires on this bike. These are 650B tires, they're 47 millimeters wide. I chose these because they've got a really nice aggressive tread. I think they're going to suit the style of this bike very well. I'm installing a pair of 105 flat mount calipers. I went with these because they were the least expensive flat mount calipers I could find. The front bled with only one pull of the syringe. The rear was more stubborn. I couldn't get fluid to pull through the system, so I had to back bleed it. I'm really impressed with this bike. It rides incredibly well. 5 minutes into that ride, I forgot I was on a 90's mountain bike. It feels just like a modern gravel bike. It also does incredibly well on dirt roads. It handled that thick, loose, sandy gravel without any issue, and it went over the washboards just fine. I think that's down to the large tires. I'm really happy with the drivetrain I installed. The gearing is spot on with where I want it to be. I was able to hold 33 miles an hour top speed, but I've also got a 1-to-1 climbing gear. Fit-wise, the bike does have a slightly aggressive position. The bars are lower than what I usually run on my other gravel bikes. I had no trouble with comfort for the entire ride. The tires are not so good on pavement. These big side knobs, when you go to turn, they make it feel pretty squirrely, and the tires make a lot of noise. While the bike turned out great and it's a lot of fun to ride, there are a couple of things I wish I'd done differently and some mistakes I made I'd like to share with you guys. So the first one is the aluminum axle nut. When I made that, the size of stock I had wasn't quite big enough. I figured that out when I went to drill the mounting hole. It turned into more of a mounting slot, so I will be making another one when I have time. The second one has to do with the paint. I didn't do a good enough job wiping it down before I sprayed the clear, and the underside of the top tube has some dirt that's then clear coated over. I realized later that this is the spot where the bike stand was clamped. I must have just forgot to wipe it down after I pulled it out of the stand and took it outside to clear coat. I really wish I'd paid a little bit more attention. Honestly, I was kind of in a hurry when I did the paintwork. I was trying to beat a thunderstorm. The third one is the zero setback seat post. I used it because I thought it would move me forward and help reduce the reach, but it turns out the reach wasn't a problem. I've found as I'm riding around that I'm constantly trying to push myself backward. I really wish I had used a setback post. The fourth mistake, the rear caliper mount sits about 3 millimeters too low, and when the caliper is fitted, it scrapes on the rotor. I modified an old brake adapter and shimmed the caliper. It works well and it looks okay, but I do wish the alignment was right without the shim. The last thing I wish I'd done differently are the drop bars. I use these because I had them on hand, but the distance between the hood and the drops is really too great. Zip makes a set of bars that I have on my other gravel bike. I wish I had used those, but they run about 50 bucks and I really didn't want to spend the money. I don't have to live with some of these. I've got an idea. Aside from those two mistakes, the rear axle nut and the rear caliper alignment, everything else on the bike actually turned out great. The paint looks amazing. I really like this setback seat post, and I think it was worth waiting for and spending the money on these zip bars. The bike fits really well, and more importantly, I think it looks great. I really enjoyed this build. I think of all the 90s mountain bikes I've converted to gravel bikes, this one's my favorite. I also really enjoyed making today's video, especially the silly travel segments and the sci-fi effects. Given the style of my channel, that's not usually something I get to do, so I really enjoyed that. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Until next time, I'll see you later.